For the next segment, we have two phenomenal women of South Asian origin who run successful businesses in the UK. So we'll have both of them come and deliver the keynote address, and once they are done, we have our own Arun Sudaman of Provoke Media to come and have a conversation with them. Our first keynote address, I invite Farzana Baduel, founder and CEO of Curzon PR, 20 years of experience. She's worked with governments of Finland, Spain, Canada, and 18 countries, governments in 18 countries. That is phenomenal. She's the founder of the Thai Women London Network, the largest global entrepreneurial network in the world. She's a trustee at the British Asian Trust, which is King Charles Charity for South Asia. And she's a resident PR expert at Oxford University. Farzana is going to be talking to us about horizon scanning, how PR can help anticipate the future. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Farzana.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to listen on my favorite topic, horizon scanning. So my background is for the last 14 years, I've been working in public relations, and prior to that, for 10 years, I was working in politics and taxation. So I stumbled across horizon scanning because for so many years, I was just focused on doing media relations and events and award submissions and all of that. And I realized that actually, when you talk about PR, a lot of people think that they think about PR in a very reductive sense. They think about it just in terms of using it synonymously with media relations. And actually, it's incredibly broad and expansive. And it's really the strategic management of information between an organization and its publics. So that means, actually, that takes you all the way from the sort of insight and the research and the strategy and the planning, as well as the delivery, the measurement and the evaluation. So it's such a broad stream of disciplines, all integrated around the nexus of communications. And what I wanted to talk about was the initial part, which is the horizon scanning, that kind of comes before the research, strategy, and planning. And the reason why I wanted to talk about it is because I was always fascinated with futurology, predicting the future. And I used to read books by Nostradamus and others, and I learned about sort of military forecasting and all the strategists of previous centuries. And I thought, actually, this is something that could be applied to PR. Because when you think about the work that we do, how many times have we worked on a campaign and it took off more than we anticipated because there was an underlying trend that we didn't anticipate, that would carry that campaign into sort of, a higher sort of amplification. And wouldn't it be great if we can harness the future forecasting, and we can harness trends, because then our work is fundamentally a lot easier. We don't have to swim upstream. We can actually swim with the current, and that takes our work forward. So today what I'll do is talk a little bit about future scanning and also talk about how we can integrate it into the work that we do to provide value to the clients. So, why is horizon scanning important? So first of all, if you look at nature, you always see, for instance, over here, you have somebody who's looking for threats. And that's how we've actually evolved as human beings. I mean, we're not obviously in the Serengeti now, but in the past, we would constantly look for threats. We'd look for snakes. We would look in the horizon for lions and so forth. And so it's inbuilt, if you look at evolutionary biology, that we're constantly looking for threats. And that's why news tends to be always slightly on the negative front. When you look at newspapers and so forth, there's always a bit of a negative tint because it's human nature to constantly look for threats and look for what's happening in the horizon. So it's really inbuilt in our psyche. But it's not just for threats. What we should also do is look at what's happening for opportunities, and that's where we can add value to our clients. And even in terms of the threats, it's important because then we can protect our client in terms of reputational vulnerability. Now, in the past, a failure of horizon scanning could result in fatal consequences of being eaten alive by an elephant, or not an elephant, a lion, or whatever. But today, if we don't horizon scan, then reputation could be damaged beyond repair. Now, why do we need a horizon scan? Because change is actually the only constant in life. The only thing that we know for sure is actually change, other than death and taxes. And so the concept of change isn't new, but what's different, as we all know, is that we are globally interconnected in a way that we never were. And we're interconnected in terms of the supply chain dynamics, as we saw during COVID, what happened where the world came almost to a standstill because of how interconnected we are from supply chain perspectives, and then also the mass communication speed. So this is obviously our arena. You could tweet today and somebody on the other side of the world can read it instantaneously. And we also have the backdrop of the economic and political turbulence, and we're moving into sort of a multipolar era, which basically means there are multiple powers that are rising geopolitically, and so that's resulting in a huge sort of change landscape. Now, iconic brands like Apple have always, looked to the future. So, innovators like Henry Ford, he didn't go and build a faster horse, because if he asked consumers, that's what they would have said back then. And likewise with somebody like Steve Jobs, what they did is that they really looked to understand what the trends are and the future. And they were dreamers. And dreaming is an integral part of understanding the future. If any of you are great readers of fiction, a lot of science fiction that we were reading 10, 20 years ago is coming to fruition today in our real life. Now, there's a very famous thinker in future forecasting, and he's called Martin Raymond, and he is a great friend of mine, and he consults for Selfridges and Spotify and so forth, and he's built rigor behind this process. And if anybody's interested, he's written a very good book that is available on Amazon, and I'm going to talk through a little bit about his concepts. So first is the anatomy of a trend. What is a trend? A trend is something that happens on a vector. It's an anomaly. And some trends, they last for a long time and becomes ingrained in the culture and results in a shift in value. Other trends tend to pass. Now, why is trends important? What I found when I was working with CEOs is I noticed that there was a lot of people being cancelled. And what I mean by that is during the Me Too movement, you had a lot of people who all of a sudden were being called out for their treatment towards women. And what I realized is that often these men were coming from a certain generation. And what they didn't realize was that in their generation, the way they treated women was acceptable in their time when they formed their values. But they didn't horizon scan. They didn't understand that over time, there's new generations were coming up and they were shifting the change of how women should be treated in the workplace. These men didn't get the memo. And because they didn't get the memo, they continued to treat women in the way that was culturally acceptable at the time during their formative years. They then didn't understand the shift in the culture, and consequently they were called out, cancelled, and a lot of them were fired or stepped down from their career. So that's an example of the lack of future scanning. If these people who are typically from the boomer generation understood what was happening and really tuning in to the new generations and the new culture shifts, that would not have happened. And that's what I found absolutely fascinating. And so when you have a lot of reputational crisis, it often comes because somebody somewhere has not been horizon scanning. They have thought that they're living in a world that doesn't change. They have stopped seeking change and shifts in culture. So that's why it's incredibly important to understand trends and cultural shifts. Now, what is the Trend Forecaster's Toolkit? All of us sitting here in a room can be a trend forecaster, and that's how we can add value and move from tactical to strategic as PR pros. Now, ultimately, what does it start off with? It starts off with being curious, to really actively listen to people, to have empathy, put yourself in the minds of other people. But ultimately, where do the trends come from? It comes from the rebels, the people who are in the margins of society, the people that we think are crazy today, But tomorrow, their ideas can end up being mainstream. So the margins of society is where you look for potential trends, where you look for these crazy rebels that are saying things. And you often have a saying that, today you end up looking at, a trend and thinking that, and reject it and think it's offensive. Tomorrow you'll end up, thinking, well, it's there, but it's for those people. And then the day after, you'll be wearing it. And so, and that's always to remember. Even if you look at someone like in terms of a person. If you look at someone like Nelson Mandela, he was considered a terrorist, and today he's considered a saint. So shifts happen over time. So it's important to understand that we don't live in a vacuum. We live in a sea of constant changing values, and if we can tap into that current, then we can protect our client brands, and we can anticipate and look for opportunities and guard our client brands against threats. Now, when we've got all these incredible data tools that we never had before, so we can see in terms of shifts in sentiment, we can see in terms of what ideas are gaining momentum, and also with the role of the influencers in sort of the trend decimation process. Also, what's interesting is looking across sectors as well as across cultures. If you see something happening in one sector, it's very possible that it will come out of that industry and move into other sectors. So those people who work across sectors have that wonderful macro perspective that they're able to see how they can actually anticipate what's happening in one sector and see the disruption in another. Now, intuition and strategic foresight. Well, people often think, what is intuition? Intuition, obviously, we've got two parts of our brain. We have the sort of reptilian brain, which tends to be sort of very sort of like fight or flight. Is what we used when our ancestors were in the savannah in Africa, fighting saber-toothed wolves or whatever. And then we have that prefrontal cortex, and they work very, very differently. And when you think of, and sometimes we could be very much sort of prone to bias, because ultimately what happens with intuition, it's about pattern recognition. What happens is you soak in so much information as we're living, and when you come across a person or a situation, you feel this intuition, but ultimately when you break it down, or you say, oh, it's from the gut, whatever, but when you break it down, it's actually pattern recognition. It's things that you have seen and read and experienced throughout your life that enables you to make a shortcut, and instead of consciously thinking about it, it's a subconscious connection that often comes from your reptilian brain. So what's really important to understand is how the two different aspects of your brain work in the way that you take in information and the way that you assess. Now, one of the biggest issues about being able to forecast is that we have to take ourselves out of ourselves and really try and develop the empathy and the curiosity to understand people, and also to be uncomfortable, to be able to listen to people that say something that sounds so offensive, but actually really have the empathy to understand where are they coming from. Because we all live in silos. And when you look at the way that we advise our clients, they live in silos. They understand the world through their perspective. They understand, they have an organizational and view, and they also have a silo thinking in terms of their job. And us as PRs, for those who work in agency, one of the biggest values that we can bring to our client is an external perspective. Often they say, often I say to clients, who are your competitors? And they often say, oh, we don't have any competitors. We are so different. We are so unique. And then actually, if you go to the market and they say, well, actually, I can't tell the difference between them and 15 other competitors in the marketplace. So I think one thing that PRs can do when we work with our clients is really bring to them something that they can't have, because we don't want clients who look at PR agencies, and look at us just as an outsourced resource to squeeze because they don't want to do the tactical implementation. What we can do that in-house PRs cannot do is bring an external perspective. And also we have the ability that when we do forecasting for clients, what we do is we don't just go and run with the internal stakeholders and meet the people in the company as well as the customers, but we also go and have conversations with people that dislike our clients, or even worse, are ambivalent towards our clients, who don't even think anything of them, that have zero interest. Because that way you get a 360 approach in actually what people think about your clients. And for instance, if one of your clients is in the fossil fuel industry, it's good to have a stakeholder interview with Extinction Rebellion or some NGO that is, very anti-fossil fuels, to really embrace the other, not just all sing from the same hymn sheet. If you sing from the same hymn sheet and you speak to everyone saying the same thing, you will never understand and learn what the potential trends that could be coming in the future. Now, network forecasting, so that's really developing a network that you can tap into in order to get insight in terms of what could be happening in the future. And the network, of course, are the internal stakeholders of the company, the organization, the partners and the suppliers. The supply chain, obviously, is incredibly important. The competitors as well, and then also the naysayers, the people who are anti the organization, to really understand where is that criticism coming from. And so building those networks is incredibly important in order to be able to tap that. And that's where external agencies, PR people in the room, can add value to their client, because if the client were to do it, they can't really sit opposite the table of a competitor and really actively listen. Whereas us as agency people, we actually can do that exercise really well and go and understand and listen to hostile stakeholders and take that information and that learning, that insight back to the client. But that requires a culture in the client to accept information, alternative views, not reject it outright, but really take it and try and understand with empathy and trying to find out how can you harness any trends in thinking that is counter-narrative to what you stand for. Now, the culture triangulation, so when you look at what's happening in terms of trends, ultimately the different areas that you look at is you look at what is happening politically, what is happening from an economic perspective, what is happening sociologically in terms of changes in shifts in attitudes. What is happening, also important, is demographics. So looking at, for instance, countries or cities and what is happening with their demographics, and that's where you see where the future influence will be. If there is a large proportion of Gen Z that is due to come to the fore in the workforce in the next 10 years, you can see how certain trends and attitudes will actually shift quickly. And so the demographics is incredibly important, and that's where you will see a lot of the shift coming through, and it could be incredibly rapid. Now, the scenario planning, so when you think about forecasting, what really it is looking at a sort of a mapping of tomorrow. What could tomorrow look like? It's not saying this is exactly what's going to happen. It's not psychic. So what it does, it comes up with so it's good to just sit down and come up with 5 to 10 future possible scenarios that could happen, and what are the opportunities and threats if those scenarios happen. And how does that impact the organization, and what can be done today? When you do those different scenarios, and then you have like a cross matrix against it in terms of what are the economic and the political headwinds that are coming, as well as the demographic and the technological and the sociological, you will then have a bit of an idea of what's the likelihood of which possible tomorrow could actually occur. And then that informs the positioning of the client and the brand. Because ultimately, if you become a brand that sort of jumps in the bandwagon, you're never going to have that respect. You're never going to have that sort of, loyalty that brands like Apple have. So it's really those brands that go a little bit forward thinking, and they anticipate the future, and they start building their position today for a future that they see will be coming in the next 5 to 10 years. So scenario planning, it's the work of dreamers, people who can sit and dream what tomorrow will look like in a multifaceted approach. And using the external collaborators is incredibly important. So bringing in the experts, bringing in the rebellious thinkers, bringing in the people who are in the margins of society, they are the ones that will show you what tomorrow could look like. And so, of course, with foresight, strategy, sprint, and innovation, these are tools that when you go to the client and you explain to them that this is something that the external perspective brings that an in-house can never do. And so this is a piece of value that can be passed on, and it will also inform the way that you then undertake your strategy and your planning and delivery. And I think this is something that sits in the wheelhouse of PRs as we're struggling to define the parameters of PRs, and there's other people swimming in our lanes. This is an area that I believe as PR people we can take and we can run and add value with clients. So what are the practical steps to horizon scanning? So the first is actually to embed horizon scanning in the organization. So whether your agency or in-house is to really to ensure that you bring in a process, and that could be a cross-functional team, and that shouldn't be just senior people. That should cut across from senior down to junior, across the functions, across the regions, in order to dream together and to have a psychologically safe space where people can come up with ideas or threats. But that would only happen if the culture of the organization allows these dreamers to come together and map out possible futures and brings in the naysayers and the external voices. Keeping an eye on competition, I'm shocked at how many times I work with organizations and they do not keep an eye on the competition. If they do, it's vanity metrics. We got 45 pieces of coverage this week, they got 47. Who cares? Really, you need to dig much deeper to understand what external perspectives are of the competitor versus your brand. Working with internal comms, because a lot of these ideas of what will happen in the future is actually already sitting in internal comms within employees of the organization, but they don't have a framework to let their ideas bubble up. And the final piece is to really change your mindset, to take a curious approach, not just read the newspaper because it makes you feel safe. It's a newspaper where the journalists write according to your values. So for instance, in the UK, I'm sort of more right of center, so I feel much more at home reading the Times or the FT, but I force myself to read the Guardian, and actually, and it's a brilliant newspaper, and what I do every morning when I wake up, I read multiple newspapers across right and left wing, and that enables me to keep my bias in check. I also, when there's something happening between, say, like Russia and Ukraine, I try and find sources written by Russian commentators in order to understand their perspective as well. So really going to the other and to really have that empathy and curiosity to listen to the other and keep our biases in check, because that will prevent us from being the PRs of the future.
Thank you. You've really timed your talk very well. Thank you, Farzana.